Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to do a retrospective analysis of a recent prediction that we did about the Mars-Uranus conjunction and how it lined up with the chart of former President Trump, especially in light of the recent assassination attempt that took place on his life on July 13th. So today, I'm recording this on July 17th, 2024. The Mars-Uranus conjunction that we associated with that, and all astrologers at this point associated with it, is just starting to finally separate at this point. So now that it's starting to get some distance and move away, I thought it would be good to look back and kind of do an analysis of what are the statements that we made about that conjunction in the lead up to it, because we actually mentioned it quite a few times before the actual event happened. So in this episode, I'm going to show some different clips from the past 7 months where we mentioned the Mars-Uranus conjunction. We talked about some of the things that we thought were going to happen around the time of that conjunction and some of the different archetypal energies associated with it. And I'm going to show those clips in order to provide some context, partially because even though our most extensive discussion of it was on the last forecast episode, we actually mentioned it at least five different episodes over the course of the past 7 months. And sometimes when an event happens, people like to go back and they listen to the most recent forecast episode to see what we said the most recently, but sometimes they forget to go back and look at other episodes that we did even further back when we referenced the same alignment and said different things about it. So part of the reason that's important is because sometimes, especially for major planetary alignments, when we're anticipating a major alignment, we'll end up mentioning it several different times on different episodes. And sometimes we're aware of the different times that we've talked about it. So sometimes we feel a little weird about repeating ourselves over and over again. So that's one of the things you have to be aware of, is that sometimes we try to avoid repeating ourselves, and therefore some of our statements about certain alignments will be made, earlier in the year when we first start talking about it, or it first comes on our radar, and then later times we may not always reiterate all the same statements over again. So I'm going to show some different clips just to look at what we did say. And I always do this myself sometimes when a major event happens, is it's nice to go back and just look at, what did we say about it? What didn't we say? And to sort of analyze the strengths of our predictions sometimes when we get something right, to also analyze the times if we get something wrong, and to see, the areas where we came really close or where we could have improved on something. And that's always interesting to me. So that's really the crux or the focal point of what I want to do here today, is to go through and look at the different statements we did make, see how close we got to actually predicting the event, but also to give you some insight into the process and how it was this evolving thing that we were trying to figure out ahead of time of what this conjunction would coincide with, and see how close we actually came to describing the event. All right, so let's see. Before we jump into it, so of course, maybe I should start by showing the charts and showing what actually happened. So on July 13th, there was a shooter who attempted to shoot and assassinate former President Trump. This happened around the same time as a Mars-Uranus conjunction, which only happens every 2 to 3 years, basically. It's not a super frequent alignment. So when one of these does happen, it always stands out, because Mars is the planet of war and violence and bloodshed and killing, traditionally in ancient astrology. And Uranus is the planet of sudden, unexpected events that happen quickly, that come out of nowhere. And so sometimes when a Mars-Uranus conjunction happens, you can get these sudden, in this instance, a very unexpected violent event that takes place. So this Mars-Uranus conjunction happened at about 26 degrees of Taurus, which was very close to the midheaven of Donald Trump in his 10th house of career and public reputation and social standing. So the Mars-Uranus conjunction was hitting a very sensitive point in his chart, which is his midheaven at 24 degrees of Taurus, and then it was also squaring his Mars at 26 degrees of Leo in his first whole sign house, which is the place that has to do with the body and the physical vitality of the native. So those are some of the things that are important, and we'll come back to why some of that's important later. Also interesting is that it's come out once the shooter was identified. His birthday was given on his voter registration, and if that information is correct, a number of astrologers, including myself, I noticed this right away, that it turned out that the shooter himself was actually born on a Mars-Uranus conjunction back in September of 2003, when Mars was retrograde at 0 degrees of Pisces and was conjoining Uranus at 29 degrees of Aquarius. So this means that the shooter himself was born on a Mars-Uranus conjunction, and then he ended up carrying out this assassination attempt on a Mars-Uranus conjunction at the same time, basically almost 20 years later. So that's some of the astrology behind this, but those are the core pieces. There's lots of other interesting astrology. I've already talked about it a little bit in a little recording that I did for patrons on my page on Patreon, a little 45-minute recording going over what was currently known about the astrology, and I'll do a fuller recap on the next forecast episode like we do at the end of each month here in just a little bit. But what I want to do now is I want to jump into playing some of the clips from some of our previous episodes. This first clip that we're going to start with, the first time we mentioned this Mars-Uranus alignment was in the year ahead forecast episode that we recorded last December. And in those episodes, we try to give an overview of what some of the major alignments are going to be over the course of the next year. And when we got to July of 2024, we really focused in on the Mars-Uranus conjunction as being one of the most important aspects of the month. So let's take a look at that and let's see what we said. That takes us into July, where in the middle of the month, we find that Mars-Uranus conjunction, which is very explosive and very unexpected on the 15th of July.
Yeah, and that happens right on top of Kaput Algol, which is a star with a fearsome track record as far as history goes. Mars, I found a precedent for Mars-Uranus in Algol that's truly horrible. I'll just say, over 20,000 people died who were not military combatants. It was. Anyway, I don't want to go into World War II horror, but that was the last precedent. That was the last Mars-Uranus on Algol. It's a very ugly configuration. We're not going to have that energy the whole time Mars is in Taurus, but that middle part of July, that's worth steering around as a configuration.
For sure. Yeah, so that also makes me think of the military technologies thing that we were talking about as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We see a lot of new devastating weapons get their premiere under Mars-Uranus conjunctions.
Really quickly, any other significations like unexpected conflicts, unexpected fights, unexpected severing or separation, revolutionary type acts and events. I'm trying to think of anything else. Like the US has a Mars-Uranus conjunction, which explains both, the Revolutionary War, but also sometimes the gun culture and stuff. I often link to that conjunction.
Yeah, well, and just the US's, how should we say, dedication to maintaining a technological edge in warfare.
Okay.
We have the United States has Mars-Uranus in Gemini, so it's even techier.
For sure. Speaking of that, so Mars transits into Gemini on July 20th. All right, so that's the first clip. So that was from December of 2023. We're really focusing in on this conjunction. We talk about it taking place specifically on the 14th and 15th, but with alignments like that, with slower moving planets, it's really something that peaks over like a week long period when Mars especially comes within about a degree of Uranus. And that's basically what happened that day, is that Mars came within or moved within alignment of a degree of Uranus. So here's the actual chart. And there we can see Mars at 25 degrees of Taurus and a few minutes, and then Uranus at 26 degrees of Taurus. So that conjunction had really come into full alignment at that point. So there back in December, we're talking about it in terms of, revolutionary things. We're talking about it. I keep mentioning it. One of the things you'll see over and over in the clips is I keep mentioning it in the context of gun culture in America, because in the United States birth chart, in the what's called the Sibley chart for the United States, there is a Mars-Uranus conjunction in the seventh house. So let me show that chart. There we go. So with the founding of the country, July 4th, 1776, Mars was at 21 degrees of Gemini, and it was in a sign-based conjunction with Uranus at 8 degrees of Gemini. So one of the things that's interesting then symbolically is I associate that because in ancient times, Mars was associated with wars, killing, swords, knives, cutting instruments, anything that could kill by cutting or severing or penetrating into something. In modern times, Mars-Uranus, because Uranus represents technology, so Mars-Uranus conjunctions can represent guns and explosions and advancements in technology for warfare and all sorts of things like that. But specifically, that conjunction in the U.S. chart is one of the things that I associate with its like culture of guns and different things surrounding guns, which is the Second Amendment and like the right to bear arms, but also the lack of restrictions on that and the way that in modern times that's led to so many different shootings, especially over the past few decades, where it seems like things have gotten out of control with, mass shootings happening really regularly. So that's something I'll mention over and over again, which is where I'm picking up on the potential like gun significations of that. But I think, it could have been articulated better in terms of that, of why I was saying gun culture, but you'll see me go into it a few different times. All right, so that was way back in December. That was us first getting wind of the Mars-Uranus conjunction, and that was going to be one of the major alignments that was going to coincide with some major events over the course of the summer. And we talked about that when we did our monthly breakdown and got to July. But then our next treatment of it, we jump forward a few months into our May forecast. So there were a few references in passing to the Mars-Uranus conjunction and how it was going to be bad in other episodes, but they were much more brief. And this clip that I'm going to show next from May is really the next time that we started to get into it in more detail. In doing the year ahead report late last year, we really focused in on May, especially because May is one of the best months for electional astrology of this year, where you have the greatest preponderance of positive placements that don't have downsides, and you have the least amount of like major downsides or afflicted planets out of any other time of the year, especially compared to later in the year, where we're going to deal with stuff like the Mars-Uranus conjunction this summer, or the Mars-Jupiter conjunction, or especially the Mars retrograde that's going to dominate the later part of this year. So I show that clip just to show how I was contrasting in May, how there was it was like a good month for electional astrology because there was some very positive planetary alignments. But then I was telling people to take advantage of that because I was contrasting it with later in the year where there would be some of the worst planetary alignments that would be much more difficult and would have much more tense energies and negative events associated with them. And one of the ones that I highlighted there was the Mars-Uranus conjunction. So that was the point of that clip. Now we jump forward to the June 2024 forecast, and let's see what was said there. And that's the opening of like Mars moving through Taurus over the next couple of months, where one of the things that's interesting about that is now Mars is building up to conjunction with Uranus. So that's another part of that energy that we immediately have to contend with, is that as soon as Mars goes into Taurus, it's co-present with Uranus. So it's building up to a Mars-Uranus conjunction that will culminate in July, I believe.
Yeah,
Um,
mid-July.
Mid-July, okay. So part of that, though, then also the other thing we have to take into account about that transit is what it's happening in the absence of, because we've had Jupiter transiting through Taurus over the past year. So whatever like difficult transits there's been this positive ameliorating or counteracting influence from Jupiter most of the time. But what we have here this month is both the departure or removal of some of that positive or counteracting energy from Jupiter, and the introduction of this more rough, difficult, tense, conflict oriented energy, with Mars moving into that sector of our chart and Mars moving into that sector of like the chart of world events.
Yeah. Which makes me wish that I had looked back at all the couple times that Mars had been in Taurus with Uranus when Jupiter wasn't there or aspecting. Because we probably delineated that a couple times on the podcast, like 2 years ago, 4 years ago, even 6 years ago, maybe.
Well, I mean, one of them was really famous. One of them was January 6th. Remember, it was
Oh, the
Mars was
with
at,
the first ingress.
yeah, the first
Right.
ingress was like Mars was at 29 Aries, and then it switched over into
Yep.
Taurus that day, the day that the bunch of Trump supporters went to the Capitol and like raided the Capitol building. That was probably the Mars ingress, like what,
Oh,
four
well,
years
yeah,
ago?
yeah. Thank you for remembering. And we got like the dude with the like the bull horns as like the shot that everybody remembers that like was emblematic of that, right?
Right.
Which Jupiter wasn't there, right? That was Jupiter in Taurus was has been trying desperately to provide a little chill over the last year,
Hmm.
and it's a little concerning is that that's what things look like with Jupiter trying to provide chill.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that was notable about that event that I remarked about at the time was it was surprising also because it was one of the few times where it seemed like Trump, because it also, since he has Leo rising, it moved into his 10th house that day. And it was
Hmm.
one of the few times where there was just like immediate backlash. And it seemed like he'd gone too far for once, because he had given a speech that led to all of that right before it happened, and that he was receiving actual like consequences for. Um, and that was an interesting, so it'll be interesting to track his transits. He's actually like leading in the polls right now in terms of the swing states for the presidential election. And the Republican National Convention is actually going to take place, I think, really close to the Mars Uranus conjunction that's going to occur in July. So for some reason, that
Isn't
convention,
isn't that his midheaven is like 25-ish Taurus,
yeah, it's around there.
which is where Mars and Uranus meet up. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's
Fortunately,
really,
we should definitely cover that next month because
yeah,
that's mid-July. But yeah,
we'll talk about that a lot. Jane in the live chat says yes, his midheaven's at 24 Taurus. So we'll talk about that, because it's also weird because then you have the Democratic National Convention that's happening in August, and that's happening right on the Mars Jupiter conjunction in Gemini, which is square Saturn.
so I don't. Yeah,
Yeah. So both of those are going to be kind of a hot mess this summer, and it will be interesting to
I,
track the
I
astrology.
I'll ride along with you on that prediction.
Okay. Yeah, you'll second that. All right. So that was our forecast from May, that we record our forecast for June that was recorded in May. It was released on May 30th. So in that, we're starting to talk about the Mars Uranus conjunction, and we're partially talking about it in the context of Jupiter moving out of Taurus and taking some of the positive counteracting influence out of that sign, leaving Mars and Uranus to form that conjunction with no real mitigations involved. And as a result of that, thinking that it would be much more difficult and much more negative than it could be otherwise. In this clip, we also really start to situate it in terms of Trump's chart because I remembered that one of the last times that Mars was in Taurus and formed a conjunction with Uranus was this period in early 2021, this 2-month period when January 6th happened, and then Trump got a lot of repercussions from that. A lot of negative things happened. He had like the second impeachment. Biden was certified actually because of January 6th. The certification process was delayed until early on January 7th, once Mars moved into Taurus, where it was forming that sign-based conjunction with Uranus. So as a result of that, the certification process happened with that, so that he was officially out of office. And then Biden was inaugurated. Trump was kicked off of Twitter. There was some other legal problems that came up for him. So I started remembering it and situating it partially in the context of just remembering one of the last times that Mars went through the 10th house in his chart, which is one of the most important houses that has to do with your career, your reputation, your overall life direction and destiny. So traditionally, he had problems with that transit of Mars through Taurus. And then it was in this episode that we really realized that it wasn't just that Mars would be going through his 10th house again, but that the actual Mars-Uranus conjunction, which we knew was going exact around 26 degrees of Taurus in the middle of July, would actually happen very near to his midheaven. So that was the thing that we started to pick up on, where we realized that this was actually going to be a crucial and important event for Trump himself that would impact his career and his reputation and his life direction. And Austin in particular was, picked up on that as something that we needed to come back to in the next episode, which we did, although we didn't go into it as much as we could have at that point, as we'll see in this clip next. But this was the point at which we started paying attention to it, especially in the context of Trump's chart, and realizing that something was up there and that there were going to be some major events. I also realized that it would happen right before and at the very beginning of the Republican National Convention. So I started thinking that there was some crazy unexpected event that somehow happened right before it that would throw things off, or that would create some sort of chaos to cast either a shadow or some sort of influence over the proceedings of the next week. So that's one of the things that I started thinking about, is wondering what that would be and what that event would be, essentially, that would happen at that time. So, yeah, I think that's good for this analysis. Let's jump forward to the next month. And this one is essentially our most recent and extensive treatment of it, which is it's the July astrology forecast episode that we did of the Astrology Podcast that was released on June 29th, 2024. So let's take a look at that. So that is going to take us into the very middle of the month, which brings us to our most dynamic and striking and potentially tense aspect of the month. But it's this Mars-Uranus conjunction that's going to take place especially on July 14th and July 15th, where Mars conjoins the planet Uranus at 26 degrees of Taurus. Looks like 26 Taurus in around 18, 19 minutes. So,
yeah. So, I guess let's break this down piece by piece. So first, right, it's a Mars-Uranus conjunction, and it's also tightly conjoined the star Kaput Algol, which is has a fearsome and well-earned reputation as being the most malefic of the bright fixed stars. So just Mars-Uranus is in and of itself quite volatile, right? What Mars and Uranus both share is a desire for things to change very quickly. And while Mars likes going fast, Uranus likes things to be sudden, shocking, too quick, like in the blink of an eye. Uranus is about like the moment of volatilization or ignition. And so when the two are combined, we almost always see accidents. You like accidents big enough to make the news of, a factory blows up, a chemical plant has a leak, and then, there's an explosion. We had like it's too volatile. And so that is, we almost always have issues there. On a personal level, it is potentially a trigger for people freaking the fuck out, right? Where we go from activated to completely to completely on fire, or someone explodes as a reaction to something, right? It's the parallel is that extremely quick chemical reaction. um it's when it's applied to human affairs, we often get or larger scale, we get violence. Violence is not uncommon. There's the accident side, but there's also the intention being associated strongly with whatever is cutting edge technologically. Mars Uranus has in the deployment of cutting edge weapons. One example being the pair of nuclear weapons that were used at the end of World War II. Both of those were deployed under Mars Uranus conjunctions. And it's, of course, worth noting that the United States, which has for a long time now been a leader in cutting edge weapons, has Mars and Uranus together in the natal chart. And so it's a volatile thing in and of itself. And then being conjunct Kaput Algol, Algol, which is in the sort of Eastern Mediterranean Greek corpus, seen as the head of Medusa, is also seen in Chinese star lore as the anchor star for the mansion of the trenches of corpses. And the ghoul in Al Ghul, Ras Al Ghul, we still use the Arabic name for the star. The ghoul is the same ghoul for which like undead corpse eating monsters in fantasy are named, right? It's the name of a corpse eating spirit, right? Like an evil daimon or jinn. And when we look at when Kaput Algol shows up historically, we see incredibly fucked up, atrocious events. We see the bombing of Guernica, for example, massive civilian casualties. And so having the Mars Uranus on top of Algol, um, it sucks. It's probably going to be totally fine for individuals who are listening to this podcast, but it almost certainly denotes some atrocious event happening, likely in one of the active theaters of conflict right now. Um, and I hope I am completely wrong about that, but it hits natal charts of countries, and yeah, it's real. I'm not. I wouldn't be worried about it on an individual level, but as far as what will be happening in the world, I will be surprised and relieved if there isn't, if there aren't notable atrocities during this period of time.
Yeah, well, that, my friend, is not a rosy picture. I think I'm trying to think of anything that you didn't say. So yeah, like sudden changes, unexpected events, and upheavals. Rebelliousness is a major one, with a strong urge to break free from restrictions and challenge the status quo. Impulsiveness, there's a common theme of people acting impulsively, taking risks before fully considering the
Mm.
consequences. Unpredictability, especially unpredictable behavior, and a tendency to act on a whim, which then ties in with sometimes there can be accidents, where the impulsive and unpredictable nature can lead to accidents or injuries. There's also a strong drive for freedom with both planets. So this can inspire feelings of like independence or strong urge for individual freedom. Sometimes this can be, we've seen in the past can not be good when you combine all those things together. Like, for example, January 6th, when all those people like took over the Capitol, was the day that Mars ingressed into Taurus and began a sign-based conjunction with Uranus. So that's kind of like a reference point that we've had over the past several years in terms of what that can look like in very stark ways. On the positive side, sometimes there can be this feeling of like excitement and adventure and like going out and doing something new, striking out on a new path suddenly and unexpectedly, doing something that's way different than what you've done up to that point. There can also be this feeling of like innovation, like innovative ideas and a drive to create something new and groundbreaking, especially because it's Mars from a mechanical or technical perspective, is very common with both Mars as well as Uranus. So I'm trying to think of some like, because there will be some very challenging things, and that's going to be a very volatile and explosive energy that's going to manifest in some probably notably negative ways, but there's also going to be some constructive instances, especially if it's forming like nice trines or
Mhm.
sextiles to planets in somebody's chart, in which case some of that energy could be channeled in more constructive directions.
Yeah, yeah. In a if your chart is in such a position that you're going to need to do something with that. I think Mars Uranus is really excellent for, um, how do we put this? Fuck it, I'm going to do it myself, and I'll do it my way.
Hmm.
Like a lot of the a number of the negative potentials there are eliminated if it's just you struggling to do something yourself. Like I'm I'm not going to I'm not going to try to work within an existing organization or order um, and try to get everybody to agree that my radical way of doing things is like just doing it yourself, just going off on your own, doing it your way, removing that social element takes a lot of the stress out of Mars Uranus because Mars Uranus are both antisocial to a meaningfully intense degree. And so removing the need to collaborate around whatever that is can be really helpful. Even if that's like going off for a few days and doing some work yourself and then coming back to whatever collaborative or institutional context you're in, but not trying to fight to do like not getting caught in a fight around Mars year around that stuff. I think is a good way to give that fiercely independent energy a good place to go.
Yeah, for sure. I'm trying to think of like people because there's positive and negative examples of that. There's like the US is obviously like the classic countrywide example of that, where both many of the good things I think associated with the unit with the US in terms of positive manifestations of independence or technological innovations or things like that come from that conjunction in the US Sibley chart, but then also some of the negative things or the downsides with that, like the gun culture or refusal to have restrictions even on basic things like that also come like from that because there can be this explosive sort of independence or this very stubborn independence to Mars Uranus conjunctions.
Yeah, fierce individualism, right?
Yeah,
Oh, and there's also a like, fuck it, we're moving to America, right? Like this, sure, we've been here for 100 generations, but it's a fucking mess. Fuck it, we're going to America is a very Mars Uranus thing.
totally, totally. And then, with accidents, a famous one of that, of course, is like Frida Kahlo and her Mars Uranus opposition. And she had that freak accident with that bus one day where she was riding on a bus and like crashed, and then she had a major injury. And that's often pointed to by astrologers to her Mars Uranus contacts and her chart that were getting activated at the time. But then also there can sometimes be other types of Mars Uranus conjunctions that are kind of like quirky or kind of wacky. Robin Williams is like a good example of that. He had Mars Uranus conjunction. It was very close in Cancer, and his kind of like wacky, zany, impulsive, like comedic style that was also very improvisational. I'm not pronouncing that right, but the ability to improv well, I think, is a very Mars Uranus thing.
Right. The spontaneity is very Uranian. And Mars is good in the pocket, right? Mars is good at decision making, like in the middle of an ongoing thing. And yet Mars Uranus certainly has potential dangers, but is not universally like this terrible, uh, terrible atrocity full combination. This particular one atop that star is a pretty nasty combination. But Mars, there's a lot you can do with Mars Uranus, and there are gifts there as well. Worth noting the charts that Mars Uranus algol hits. One, um, I would look at the royal family of England because there's a ton of algal stuff to the British royals. And so I would be surprised if there wasn't some meaningful development on such a rare conjunction atop algol, considering how much algol stuff is in that family. It also hits the chart of the EU, the moon, in the chart of the EU, which is at 24 of Taurus, and it also hits the sun in Israel's chart. It connects to other national nativities, but those are the conjunctions that I'm aware of.
Yeah, and that week, the Republican National Convention is actually taking place July 15th through the 18th. So, um,
Madness. They do
yeah,
not
so it's
have an. I know you were, there was a like, oh, is there a possibility that Trump has an astrologer and that's why the debate
right.
is where it is. The Republican National Convention does not have an astrologer. That is, I would not schedule my event for then.
Yeah, so that's one check mark. We've got one for and one against, but yeah, so there may be some unexpected developments of that. Of course, just a few days earlier on the 11th, he's going to be sentenced when Mars is like right on his midheaven. So there could be some explosive stuff with respect to him that week that we'll
Yeah,
be following.
yeah, almost certainly.
All right. So that was a longer clip, and there was some extraneous stuff I could have cut out, but I wanted to just play the entire clip in its entirety so that you can see the different ways that we were talking about the Mars Uranus conjunction, which were largely negative. Austin was talking especially about how it would be this conjunction was unique because it was going to be conjunct the fixed star Algol, and in the constellations that represents the head of Medusa. So there's this head symbolism with Algol, which ended up working out in a really striking way in the end, in the sense that Trump, they attempted to shoot Trump in the head, and the bullet ended up just grazing his ear barely. So there was head symbolism. Austin was using keywords like sudden, something sudden, shocking, violence, talking about cutting edge weapons, which actually ended up working out in a separate way that I'll talk on the next forecast episode, where Russia unveiled some new weapons and released a video of them recently on the day of the conjunction. So other keywords during the course of that, an atrocious event. I, of course, as I always do, try to balance things out and talk a bit about the positive things. So I tried to talk about some of the positive potential manifestations of this, especially if it was hitting somebody's chart in a more positive or flowing way. But we also return back to themes of like gun culture and guns. Austin talked about going out and doing something on your own, and that actually reminds me in retrospective that it was like a lone gunman. Um, so yeah, so that ended up being part of the context. And one of the clips I actually forgot to include from earlier in the episode is that we talked a little bit about how earlier in the episode, as we were doing the recap for the previous month, Trump had just been convicted of a felony, and his sentencing actually was supposed to take place on like July 10th or 11th, or that week, basically. So at this point, in late June, when we did this forecast episode, I was under the impression, because I noticed that his sentencing was going to take place near the Mars-Uranus conjunction, I started being under the impression at that point that that's what the Mars-Uranus conjunction event was going to be, was that it was going to be related to his sentencing, and that that was for the Stormy Daniels like bribery case, which kind of made sense because on one of his previous Mars transits, that was when he was first indicted for that, I believe. Yeah, back in February 15th of 2021 was when the judge set the date for the trial and for the hush money trial and denied a motion to dismiss the case. So things really started sort of going in that direction back then when Mars was in Taurus in 2021, which was pretty close to a conjunction of his midheaven and his Mars-Uranus conjunction. So, so this is tricky, and this is part of the reason why the analysis is kind of interesting at this point, is that there were two known events that came up that we knew were going to happen, which was like the RNC was going to start around or just after. It was going to happen, most of it just after the Mars-Uranus conjunction would go exact, and that he was supposed to be sentenced the week it went exact, actually a little before the exact conjunction on like the 10th or the 11th. So I started assuming that that event of the sentencing would be, for some reason, what the Mars-Uranus conjunction would be about on his midheaven as like a negative event potentially. But it didn't quite make a lot of sense because nobody expected him to be sentenced to jail for that case, even if he was sentenced. So there was still a little bit of a question of like, well, is the sentencing of that already enough to take up the symbolism of that conjunction? And is that all that's going to be? Or is there going to be something else that happens sort of in between those dates and right before or in the lead up to the Republican National Convention, which then started, I believe, on the 15th. So unfortunately, I think part of that then was true in that it ended up being relevant. But what happened actually after we recorded this forecast episode is that the Supreme Court passed a decision which ended up making it so that they could delay the sentencing of that trial. So the sentencing didn't end up taking place. And that was one of the things then that happened, is that didn't end up being the event for that week. And so at some point after the forecast came out, once that news came out with the Supreme Court decision and how it affected and delayed the sentencing from that conviction and from that trial, then there was a question that started to arise about, well, what is the event then if it's not that sentencing? So I think I start to wrestle with that at that point, at some point in early July. And there's one more clip I wanted to show, I believe, which is from an episode of the Secret Astrology Podcast, which is a podcast that is available to patrons of the Astrology Podcast who sign up to support my work through my page on Patreon. And it's one of the benefits on one of the higher tiers on my Patreon. So in this episode, which was released on June 30th, 2024, I talked with my friends Nick Dagan Best and Patrick Watson, and we did kind of like a research project where we did a study session just going through all the different charts for the presidential election and talking about them, and trying to weigh the different factors that were pointing in different directions in terms of what the outcome of the election would be. So I released this on June 30th. So not a lot of new developments had happened, because at this point I'm still thinking that the sentencing is like the main thing that was going to happen around that time that would soak up some of the symbolism of the Mars-Uranus conjunction. But it is interesting some of the statements that were made during this podcast. So let me share a clip from that now. he had some good things. This Uranus transit is coming up on Mars, but that's still impending when Uranus gets to 26 degrees of Leo. That'll be a little tricky in having the Mars Uranus come up, but that's going to take place right around the time that he has sentenced. Basically, his sentencing is when Mars hits about like 23 degrees of Taurus, pretty close to his midheaven, and then weirdly the RNC takes place right after that. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. We just got done talking about the debate, and now we were going to talk about the RNC chart.
All right. Yeah, that RNC chart. Uh, the first thing that struck me about it is
Well, have
the
you been following everything? Did you watch the debate?
yeah, yeah. So I just I was just remembering that Nick and I previously talked about the RNC chart and how it features that Mars Uranus conjunction in Taurus, which reminded us of the January 6th incident
Right,
and
right.
the
The raid at
FBI,
Mar-a-Lago.
yeah, the Mar-a-Lago, uh, uh, I guess raid they call it.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
So
was
Those
that raid?
the
Was the raid the one that happened subsequent to that when Mars was like right on his midheaven in early
yeah, that was
2021?
no, that was January 6th of 2021 was the insurrection. That was Mars
Mm.
Uranus. And then a year and a half later, uh, late July, early August of 22, there
Oh,
was
okay.
another Mars Uranus conjunction in Taurus, and that was when the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago.
I was
So
trying to
yeah, there's
remember. I knew there was some intermediate like Mars and Taurus event that happened on his midheaven because that midheaven kept being sensitive
yeah,
to that transit, but I forgot what the intermediate one was.
yeah,
right.
well, it was a big
So
one.
So,
well,
and then
Boxes
he's
in the
about to,
boxes in the shower and chandeliers. And,
well, and he's about to be sentenced on July 11th when Mars is like right at 23 degrees of Taurus, which is also right in his midheaven. So it's going to be a little past that now. And that's one of the things actually don't understand about the RNC is this Mars-Uranus conjunction sounds more like what I would expect the Democratic convention is going to look like this year, which is just like absolute chaos and like anarchy and people protesting and internal division and everything else. So I don't really understand why
I
this has such a unstable signature to it for at least that conjunction.
one theory I have is that the Mars Uranus conjunction will still be applying on the previous week when the sentencing happens. Um, uh, we know that the past two times, at least in the context of Trump, this conjunction between Mars and Uranus and Taurus has been about um, unwelcome intrusions, trespassing onto
right.
property, and so I wonder if there will be some kind of unhinged intrusion, perhaps on the sentencing, where we have a kind of similar
Right.
type of
Sure.
situation where you have sort of trespassers, onto the realm, the domain of wherever he is. That's kind of where we'll see this kind of unhinged Mars sort of playing itself out.
Hmm.
So I
And
could. So go ahead.
I only wanted to just to add to that before you continue that in January 6th and the Mar-a-Lago raid, I believe in both instances, Mars was also like not yet conjunct Uranus, but approaching the conjunction, like close enough to call it a conjunction, but it was still applying. So that stands for that supports what you're suggesting for the sentencing.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So this is the chart where I'm sort of approximating when I think his speech will probably take place towards the end of the convention, I assume. So this is the last day of the convention, July 18th, about 7 p.m. Actually, that's 7 p.m. what Central Time, so that would be 8 p.m. It'll probably actually be later than that. It'll probably be an hour later because it'll be like 9 p.m. Eastern time, probably. I'm guessing, like just like the debate was, but nonetheless, still probably Capricorn rising. It's interesting then that this is going to be the same rising as the first debate chart, but now it'll be a day chart rather than a night chart. So the Saturn as the ruler of the ascendant in the third won't be so terrible in terms of communication necessarily. Transiting Venus, we can see is in Leo in his first house and Trump's first house, and Mercury's there as well. Those are pretty good for him. I mean, that's relatively positive.
But that Mercury is being squared by the Mars-Uranus, of course.
Yeah, well, this is just like 2 days before this full moon that looks like really intense that occurs at 29 Capricorn, and Mercury is like squaring Uranus exactly then. So it's like there's some craziness that happens like a couple of days later for sure, but I'm not sure if this is close enough yet for that to be a factor. I mean, I guess this Mercury also 3 degrees later at 26 will also hit his Mars, but it's not quite there yet. So I don't know if that's affecting this speech necessarily or if it's something that happens like right afterwards.
Hmm. If we think about, Mercury kind of describing the quality of speeches in a given time, then it's not hard to imagine that with Mercury applying to Trump's Mars and receiving a transiting square from the Mars-Uranus conjunction, that he'll probably be verbally channeling the the qualities of that conjunction to his natal Mars and to the transiting Mars-Uranus. He'll definitely be speaking to that kind of, well, the insurrectionist kind of ethos, that marked that original conjunction in 2021.
It does. It looks very belligerent.
Very much so. This is
Looks like transiting Sun will be conjoining his Venus, the ruler of the 10th, which was helpful during the debate when transiting Uranus sextiled that almost exactly the same day. Looks like the moon is going to be passing over his natal moon. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, plus, so transiting Venus is on top of his Pluto almost, or 2 days from there.
And look, it's effectively a coronation, right? I mean, he doesn't have a challenger. Right. Like it's not, it's the absolute opposite of what'll be happening for Biden. I mean, he's got his opponents, but those opponents aren't even considered Republicans anymore,
Sure.
The Cheneys or whoever.
So then I guess the only open question is just we know the negative event that happens before for him is going to be the sentencing, which is going to take place when Mars is on his midheaven. The only question is just if there is some sort of unexpected disruption that comes from the Mars-Uranus conjunction during the RNC, or if that and some of the other transits are just the sort of belligerence that you guys were mentioning. All right. So yeah, so that was the casual episode, and it's really interesting how we're talking about it because I'm still assuming that the case is that the sentencing is like the main thing, but I'm wondering if there's not some sort of unexpected event that happens at the beginning of the RNC or around that time, because I'm still focused on the Mars-Uranus conjunction and how that seems to cast a shadow over the subsequent RNC. And what's interesting is then we were expecting the energy of the Mars-Uranus conjunction then to be really present in the RNC and some of the events that took place during it. But what's happening now is actually the event that occurred, the Mars-Uranus event that occurred just 2 days before it, is altering and casting a shadow over everything and impacting the way that people are talking and things like that. So ironically, the Uranian element is that a lot of the speeches are like less divisive or fired up because of this incredibly divisive or like violent event that just occurred right beforehand, that's sort of like changing the nature of the discussions, at least this week, in terms of the presidential race. So Patrick said some really amazing things there in terms of he was really getting close to something, because we were talking about the past incidences and how January 6th happened during when Mars went into a sign-based conjunction with Uranus. And also they noted in this instance that the Mar-a-Lago raid of Trump's home, when the FBI like raided his house and pulled out all of these classified documents that he wasn't supposed to have, that actually happened the last time that Mars was in Taurus and was conjoining his midheaven. So what was interesting is that Patrick was picking up on that there was an archetypal theme from the past two instances of this transit for Trump that had to do with like unwelcomed intrusions, or he said unhinged intrusions. And that ended up actually being very, very close to the actual symbolism, where you had this kind of like unwelcome intrusion or unhinged intrusion of this guy that literally tried to assassinate or tried to murder Trump when that Mars-Uranus conjunction again happened on his midheaven. So even though it wasn't like an exact repetition of events, there was this interesting echo of a similar theme that was coming up over and over again. In this episode, or in this section, one of the things I touched on briefly at the very beginning is I noted how Uranus, so much of the discussion at this point has happened surrounding the transit of Mars and Uranus to Trump's midheaven, which in the last two instances over the past 4 years, first in 2021 and then in 2022, has been negative for Trump in terms of his career, especially in his reputation and other things like that, because it's his 10th house. But this is one of the first times when I mentioned Uranus, how Uranus will square his Mars in the first house once it gets to 26 degrees of Taurus. And that ended up being really important, and that was the part that we didn't emphasize enough, because we were paying so much attention to the midheaven because the historical precedent of that. But Uranus did switch over into 26 degrees of Taurus and squared his Mars. And that was the part that was actually indicative of something that was dangerous to him physically, because he has this Mars in the first house in a day chart conjunct the degree of the ascendant, with Mars at 26 degrees of Leo and the ascendant at 29 degrees of Leo. So the first house represents the body, the physical incarnation of the native, their health, and other things like that. And actually, I talked about this on an episode, but that's the part of this that wasn't just potentially problematic for him in terms of career, like we were focusing on the midheaven, but that was the part of this that indicated a potential physical danger, was Mars being activated by the Mars-Uranus conjunction in his first house conjunct his ascendant, because a malefic in the first house, one of the manifestations can sometimes be a physical injury, accident, scars, or other things like that. So what's interesting about this, and this is in the very last clip that I'm going to play here today, is I actually discussed this in the last episode of the Astrology Podcast that I released before this and after the last forecast episode, where I actually did a whole episode on the first house in astrology, which was released on July 7th, 2024, about a week before the assassination attempt. And what's crazy about it is that I actually, one of my examples that I used when I got to, because in that episode, I went through each of the planets and I showed different examples of what it meant when a certain planet was in the first house and how it had worked out in the lives of different major celebrities. And when I got to Mars, one of my core examples was I used the birth chart of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who had Mars in the first house and was famously shot by an assassin and was assassinated, and that was what started World War I. So let me play that clip right now, because I think it's the last piece here that's kind of interesting and relevant in terms of all of the different pieces that came together that we were talking about over the past month, that could have fallen into place and did in like interesting ways in terms of how it all worked out. So we've talked about some of the character ones and people tending to be more direct and stuff. There's other like difficult first house ones, like for example, Archduke Franz Ferdinand had Mars and Sagittarius in the first house in a day chart, and they were famously assassinated by like a revolutionary, and that's what started World War I, basically. So
Yep.
here's their chart. So we see Sagittarius rising, the sun ascendant at 18 Sagittarius, the sun at 25 Sagittarius, and Mars in the first whole sign house at 0 degrees of Sagittarius. And yeah, there was that famous story of their unfortunate assassination and being shot, and that ending their life and then starting a war that took over like the entire world for a period of time. That's the challenge though sometimes with Mars in the first house, is like sometimes the question, it can be a fine line between like, are you the person that's saying what everyone's thinking but not saying, and that's a good thing because so I think I used that example of like Franz Ferdinand and his assassination with Mars in the first house, because we went through some literal manifestations of Mars in the first house and how they had indicated physical injuries or ailments to the body, and associating Mars with guns especially, and sometimes gun-related violence or injuries happening to the person. So I used Franz Ferdinand as an example. I also used Hemingway as an example, who had a number of accidents throughout the course of his life, but in the end of his life, he also committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. But then, in order to talk about other examples of Mars in the first house, I also talked about it in terms of character traits, because sometimes Mars in the first house manifests literally in terms of the body, but also it can manifest in terms of the person's mind and character and how they act in the world. And what's crazy about that is that I then used an example just a few examples later. One of my next examples was Trump. So let's watch the rest of that clip. It needs to be said, or are you the person who's like saying the thing that shouldn't be said, that's actually really offensive and unnecessary, where you're just creating unnecessary drama by being overly, brusque or rude or other things like that?
Yeah, it can run the gamut. When you're a hammer, everything's a nail,
Sure. So speaking of that, that's actually my next example, which is Rush Limbaugh had Aquarius rising with Mars in Aquarius in the first house. So that's like the other example. And then of course it's like today, the contemporary sort of version of that to some extent, who everyone's familiar with, is just Donald Trump has late Leo rising and Mars conjunct the ascendant, and that's also very much part of his personality, or that Mars element is very much part of his personality in terms of similar things, and in terms of, let's say, like divisiveness. That's really actually a really good keyword, that sometimes like divisiveness is a core keyword, and like sometimes that divisiveness, as I explained earlier with like the protests, is sometimes necessary. Other times the divisiveness can be not necessary, but it can just be something that happens or arises from the person for different reasons. All right, so that was the last piece that I just thought was interesting, and as an aside, in terms of bringing everything together, that one of the last discussions I had was just talking about Mars in the first house. I used an example of like an assassination, and then talking about it within the context of, up to that point, Trump's personality being very Mars conjunct the ascendant, but then literally less than a week later, he had a manifestation, a literal manifestation of Mars conjunct the degree of the ascendant in a day chart, in that somebody tried to shoot him and a bullet or something hit his ear and cut him, and then there was blood, which is another Mars related thing, and then he'll probably have, I assume, like some sort of scar from that or something, which is also something we talked about in the Mars discussion about the first house, is sometimes people that have Mars in the first house having scars, but sometimes when you have a scar, there's a reason for it, that usually there's some sort of injury or accident that preceded it. So, all right. So I think that's it. My main comment that I highlighted, that I made at the very end of the last forecast episode, was just that there would be something explosive for Trump in that week, coinciding with that Mars-Uranus conjunction. Let me find that clip again if I can. He's going to be sentenced when Mars is like right on his midheaven. So there could be some explosive stuff with respect to him that week that will
Yeah.
be following.
Yeah, almost certainly.
Yeah, so I think that ended up being true. There was some explosive stuff that week. One of the take-home lessons is that while sometimes if there's a known event coming up that you think is going to coincide with the transit, especially if it doesn't line up perfectly with the dates, I think one of my take-home lessons is that you then need to not assume that it's only going to be that event, but instead need to open it up for the potential for other events, which we kind of did, but we could have gone into even further. And I think I was a little bit distracted by knowing about the sentencing and assuming that that would soak up a decent amount of the symbolism, even though it didn't really make sense why, because we didn't expect a lot of unexpected stuff from that sentencing. Really, the most unexpected thing was that the Supreme Court decision came out of nowhere and got rid of it completely. That ended up actually happening with another of his cases right on the day of the conjunction. The what was it? It was the classified documents case ended up being dismissed by the judge. So that happened, I believe, on the 15th, which was the actual day of the conjunction, which actually did end up being a separate, unrelated, and reporters were referring to it as like surprising or shocking, and as a positive break for Trump. Also, on the day of the actual conjunction on the 15th, that was the first day of the RNC, and Trump actually announced his vice presidential pick of J.D. Vance. So that ended up being another major development for him, and we'll see how that works out in terms of the future. But let's see. Other than that, final thoughts. Yeah, so I hope this has been useful or insightful in terms of giving you some insight into what we said on the podcast, into showing how our views of things can like grow and develop over the course of like a 6 or 7 month period as we get more information. How you yourself could go about trying to make predictions and the different factors that are involved, or the different things that we're trying to take into account, and the things that you know that you can take into account versus the things that you don't know. Like, for example, we never could have known or taken into account ahead of time that the shooter who would carry out the assassination attempt on the Mars-Uranus conjunction, that he would actually be born on a Mars-Uranus conjunction. So it's like sometimes there are factors and charts that you're not aware of that are working in the background that will become prominent, and all you can do is work with the things that you are aware of. So we were aware of, for example, the Mars-Uranus conjunction. We knew that was going to be a rough aspect right in the middle of July. We became aware of Trump's chart and how that would hit his midheaven very closely. So we were expecting some 10th house things related to that. I think we could have emphasized the first house things even more related to Mars being placed in his first house. And then I think we would have actually sharpened and gotten a little bit closer to the actual manifestation, which was this physical, what ended up being a physical injury for him, although really was potentially like life-changing event that could have ended his life at that point, a life-threatening event that happened. So I am kind of careful with political predictions and things like that. So I don't think I ever would have gone out of my way to like say things too explicitly in terms of that. So there probably would have still been some couching things in more careful language. But nonetheless, I think what we were able to say, and just the fact that, we're just one astrology channel that picked up on the Mars-Uranus conjunction, that interpreted the symbolism archetypally to the best of our abilities, and got surprisingly close in terms of narrowing down what I think will be one of the most important events of the year, and potentially a notable event that changes history, just by paying attention to the mundane astrology and trying to call it like we saw it. But there were other astrologers who did other forecasts who also pointed out that Mars-Uranus conjunction. So at the very least, I wanted to do this retrospective video just to talk about that and call some attention to that, because I think it's a good demonstration of what astrologers are doing and how they are picking up on this natural property of the universe, which is sometimes telling us when important events are going to take place, through the alignment of the planets and through this sort of these omens or this symbolism that arises from it that can actually describe to you sometimes the nature of an upcoming event. I don't think we would have been able to pick up on or describe that to the extent that we did if astrology wasn't a legitimate phenomenon. And I hope in showing some of these clips, I've sort of demonstrated the extent to which we did, as well as the extent of our limitations or the extent to which we didn't as well, because there's always room for improvement. And that's one of the things I always get from these events is I always go back and try to look at what we said and look at the process of how we got there, and also try to see how we can improve and like what we could have done different or better next time. But this is just one example, and this is something that we're just constantly doing each month with these month ahead forecast episodes, where we try to look at the mundane planetary alignments and we try to predict the future. So I think that's it. There's a lot more to come. There's a lot of other events and alignments this year and other things that we'll get into in future forecast episodes. So I look forward to having some of those discussions and also checking in with Austin in the next forecast episode and sort of recapping what happened and our predictions and some of the things surrounding that. But for the purpose of this, I think this is sufficient here. So I think I'll sign off. So thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast. Thanks to all the patrons that supported this work, since that's what allows us to keep doing these episodes as much as we do and to devote as much time to studying these planetary alignments ahead of time and sharing them with people as we do. So thanks for your support. And I think that's it. So I'll see you again next time. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to some great subscriber benefits, including early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the forecast each month, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, which is only available to patrons, a whole exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. You can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozbaz, and Kwatsi Ali Barohu. If you're looking for a reliable astrologer to get an astrological consultation with, then we have a new list of astrologers on the podcast website that we recommend for readings. Most of the astrologers specialize in birth chart readings, although some also offer synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Find out more information at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology, where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com.